Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman.
Welcome to the David Pakman Show. I am Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. And might I also say, happy reinstatement week, right? Because coming up at the end of this week, August 13th, isn't that the day that the conspiracy theorists tell us Donald Trump might be reinstated as president? So, I guess we have that to look forward to as well. Of course, Mike Lindell, MyPillow CEO, who David had a wonderful interview with this past week. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. He had originally said August 13th could be the day. He has since kicked the can down the road a little bit. Maybe it's September, he tells us. Maybe it's even after that. Who the heck knows at this point? But one thing is for certain. The Department of Homeland Security is certainly taking all of this very seriously. Late last week, the Department of Homeland Security actually sent out notices to state and local law enforcement offices throughout the country that said this. DHS is providing awareness of reports regarding an increasing but modest level of activity online, calling for violence in response to unsubstantiated claims of fraud related to the 2020 election and the alleged reinstatement of former President Trump. As public visibility of the narrative increases, we are concerned about more calls to violence. Reporting indicates that the timing of these activities may occur during August 2021, although we lack information on specific plots or planned actions. So Homeland Security says right now, and they've been saying this for a couple months, in case you haven't been following that story, listen, we have seen what these individuals are capable of. We saw it on January 6th when they get worked into a frenzy based on lies and misinformation. We've seen what they're capable of doing. And over the months since January 6th, they have been pushing this conspiracy that somehow, some way, Trump's going to get reinstated. So what happens when that doesn't happen? See, that's what they're worried about, is what happens when the conspiracy theory proves to be totally false, right? Trump is not going to be reinstated as president on August 13th or at any time unless he wins a future election. And that's not reinstatement, that's winning an election. But either way, people are going to be angry. People who have been led to believe these things, we don't know how they're going to react. And that is what Department of Homeland Security is saying. They have seen what they believe to be threats of violence online. However, there's been no specific indication of where, when, how, or even really if it's going to happen. A threat is one thing, an actual plan is a totally different thing. And Homeland Security is just basically telling everybody, be on the ready. And that's a terrifying thought. Right? We don't want to have to live our lives with this kind of fear of what's going to happen when the Trump people don't get their way, when these cultists realize that their conspiracy theories are totally false. We shouldn't have to live with that. But unfortunately, right now, this is a reality that far too many of us, well, not far too many, all of us have to accept. Here's another thing, too. And I've talked about this in videos on my other channels, but you also have the judges, okay? The people hearing the cases, listening to these defendants who were arrested as part of the January 6th Capitol riot. And the judges have flat out told us these individuals learned nothing. These individuals are likely to do this again because the same kind of lies and misinformation that got these people worked up in the first place, they're still out there. And these judges are trained through years and years of experience to recognize what a so-called repeat offender looks like. They look at the psychology, they look at the behavior, they look at mannerisms, for God's sake. And they see it, as they have told us, with some of these individuals. And we've also had at least one judge come out and say, I'm afraid these people are getting off too lightly for what they actually did that day, and therefore will definitely not learn a lesson. And these are people we're going to have to keep watching because they're likely to do it again. And that's what Homeland Security is trying to tell us. Now, nobody wants to live in a police state, trust me. But they're concerned that what happens this weekend when Trump doesn't get reinstated could be very bad for the country. And if you don't believe that these people are actively organizing, then take a look at this story. You have a Trump ally by the name of Matt Brainerd, who says that they're going back to the Capitol. He appeared on Steve Bannon's podcast last week where he said, quote, "As we continue to raise the profiles of these individuals," talking about the people who were arrested in the Capitol riot, "it makes it harder and harder for the left's phony narrative about an insurrection to stick. We're going to push back on the phony narrative that there was an insurrection." And they have scheduled a Justice for J6th rally in D.C. for September 18th. September 18th is the date that he gave on Steve Bannon's podcast. Now, he says that he has gone through, he's gotten this whole thing approved according to what he said during this interview. This is a planned rally that is going to take place. He also says he totally has lawmakers signed up that are gonna, come and speak at this little event. Of course, he won't tell us who they are yet. But, if I had to make a guess as to the kind of people that would speak at this, perhaps a Mo Brooks, a Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, those kind of seem like the folks that would be drawn to an event like this. Of course, time will tell. He, again, has not released their names. He says they will once they're totally confirmed to the event. But folks, we now have a date. We have a date of when they're going back to Washington, D.C., September 18th. That's the day that they've planned. And this is supposed to be just a big rally to raise awareness about the conditions of the people who were arrested. But here's the other part of this story, folks. We have seen both Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I believe Jim Jordan was with them as well, make a spectacle of themselves, as they always do, trying to go into the jail where some of these January 6th defendants are being held. Now, they didn't have pre-clearance. They didn't have an appointment. They showed up with a film crew knowing they were going to be shoved away, because you can't just do that. And then they tried to use that as some kind of justification that, obviously the conditions these people are being held in are so terrifying they won't let us in. There is no evidence at all to suggest that any of these individuals are being treated inhumanely or unfairly while they're waiting in prison, okay? No evidence exists to suggest any of that. So let's get that very clear right now. The people pushing that are the ones who, I guess, have a vested interest in getting people to think that bad things are happening to these individuals. Because, I don't know, maybe they get to have more people show up at their rally if they think that these people are being held in inhumane conditions, or if that they're somehow being treated unfairly. But again, don't get sucked into those lies, because there is no evidence to suggest that any of this is actually happening. It is a political talking point. It is a political stunt. It is pure theater. So don't buy into it. But what we do obviously have to be concerned about is last time we had a gaggle of these folks show up in Washington, D.C., it ended in the January 6th Capitol riot. Now, you can call it a riot if you want. You can call it an insurrection. You can call it a failed coup. Call it whatever you want. Terminology we can quibble over all day long, and it's a pointless conversation. The fact of the matter is, these people showed up there on January 6th, broke into the Capitol, smashed windows, broke down doors. Multiple people on both sides, the police officers and the individuals who stormed the Capitol, dead from this. We don't need another show like that. We don't need something like this to happen again. So I hope the authorities are taking this seriously, not to go down there and bust them up. If they've got permits for it, hold your rally. It's going to be filled with lies, and I hope nobody walks out of there actually thinking anything you're saying is true. But if you've done the due diligence, if you've filed the paperwork, you have a right to assemble, and nobody should infringe upon that. We just got to make sure that D.C. is protected and that these individuals don't once again fall victim to the lies of charlatans who know what they're saying is false. Oh, and by the way, always happen to disappear before things get too rowdy. So they can say, oh, I wasn't even there for that. I was just there for the rally. Yeah, they throw you folks under the bus. Remember that if you travel to D.C. for that September 18th Justice for J6 rally. And while we're on the topic of election lies, let's talk about Lin Wood for a moment. The Trump-loving lawyer recently got smacked down in an embarrassing way by yet another court over his bogus election fraud claims. Now, Lin Wood, I'm sorry, he's such a comical character. If he weren't so, obviously, whatever. But anyway, Lin Wood goes out December of last year, files multiple different lawsuits alleging fraud, but the main ones he filed were in the state of Georgia, where he had two separate lawsuits going. One challenging the results of Georgia's presidential election. The other one actually came a little later in January, challenging the Senate election. And in that challenge, which the first one, the election challenge in general, was thrown out, said it was baseless. The other one got thrown out for a second time by the Court of Appeals late last week because they said that, Lin Wood, you have no standing in this case. So here's what Lin Wood was actually challenging here. Wood came out and said that because they changed the rules, the state changed the rules for signature verification, the whole thing is fraudulent and you cannot trust it. They didn't have the same signature verification for the absentee ballots that were obviously very prevalent in that Georgia runoff election. So, the first court that looked at this, way back in early this year, said, yeah, you don't have standing to say any of this. The state legislature, controlled by Republicans, passed a law that gave their Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, the ability to change the rules for the absentee ballots because it was in the middle of a pandemic. They knew they were going to have a lot of absentee ballots. They were counting on it. That is what their election was basically going to have to be because of the pandemic. He had the authority to do this, the authority given to him by the state. You, therefore, have no standing, Lin Wood. And the Court of Appeals last week basically told him the exact same thing. You have no injury. You have no actual claim of illegal activity, again, because he was given the authority to do this. States, as we all know, have the authority to determine how their own elections are run without the interference of outside forces. So no, Mr. Wood, you don't get to come into these courts and tell us that something illegal happened when all of the changes that you're actually challenging were approved by the state. No injury, no illegal activity, no standing for Mr. Lin Wood. I don't know how many total court losses this brings us to at this point with people like Lin Wood and Giuliani and Sidney Powell, but I can promise you they're going to continue to lose. But of course, that hasn't stopped the Republicans in all these states where the lawsuits are losing from enacting these highly oppressive and repressive voting laws. So that, I guess, is the silver lining for Republicans. You may be losing the court battles, but you've won the war on voter suppression for now. We have to take a quick break. I'm Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman. We'll be right back.
What if you could read 10 books in just one sitting? That's exactly what one of my favorite apps lets you do. It's called Blinkist, and what they do is take thousands of popular nonfiction books. They condense them down into text or audio that you can consume in 15 minutes. Blinkist makes sure that you're getting all of the important core insights from each book. So it's perfect for exploring a book you otherwise wouldn't have time for. If there's a full book you're thinking about buying, you can use Blinkist to get a sample first. Just think how much you can enrich yourself by being able to soak up an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way. and it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month, and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I am Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. And if you happen to enjoy me here, you can catch me on the Ring of Fire YouTube channel, youtube.com/The Ring of Fire. You can also find me on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Farron Balanced. Of course, I'm all over all social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Farron Balanced. Now let's talk about COVID for a minute, right? Obviously, biggest story happening in the country right now, especially as we have children heading back to school within the next few weeks. Florida, where I am right now, 20% of nationwide COVID cases coming from this state. Our kids go back to school today. And we still don't have statewide mask mandates because our governor, Ron DeSantis, actually signed a ban on mask mandates. It was an executive order, to be perfectly honest. And the Republican-controlled legislature, by the way, a long time ago during the pandemic, actually gave him the authority to do that. Now, as I mentioned on this program on Friday, some counties have defied DeSantis' order. And so over the weekend, though, you had Republican Senator Bill Cassidy from the state of Louisiana actually come out on CNN's State of the Union and take a couple shots at Ron DeSantis for banning mask mandates for children in school. Here's what Cassidy said. "I'm a conservative. I think you govern best when you govern closest to the people being governed. And if a local community is having their ICU is full and the people at the local schools see that they've got to make sure they stay open because otherwise children miss out for another year of school, and they put in policy, then the local officials should be listened to." Now, he kind of didn't say that as clearly as possible, but he was asked about the mask mandates because we have one here in Florida. They got one in Texas, two of the worst states in the country with COVID. And that was his response. Like, you got to let the local officials make those decisions. Not every county here in the state of Florida is as bad as the one next to it. Now, it's bad all over the state, don't get me wrong. But this should be the decision, up to the local officials here. But DeSantis took away cities and counties' right to make that decision for themselves, and that is what Cassidy is actually taking a swipe at here. We've seen it happen in Arkansas. We're seeing it happen in Texas, where the actual authority is being stripped from local communities and instead given to one person at the top of that food chain. Florida, it's DeSantis. Arkansas, who now says he regrets it, is Hutchinson. Texas, it's Abbott. Meanwhile, Louisiana, who is also seeing a massive spike in COVID, they're going back to mask mandates. Okay, it's a red state, but they have enough good sense to say, listen, things are bad. And so we have to go back to this. If people aren't going to voluntarily protect themselves, we're going to have to put the law in place, the rule in place that says you have to protect yourself because it's not just you. It's literally everybody else around you. And that's when it changes from being about personal choice, as too many Republicans want to say, to a public policy health issue. And that is something that can be governed. That is something that can be legislated. If it is a public health concern, what you and your individual choices are, then yeah, that can be regulated. People love to use the example of drunk driving. And that really is a great example. If you want to sit on your couch and drink a handle of vodka and then just pass out for the night, that's your personal choice. Okay? And as long as you're of age, nobody can stop you from doing that. However, if you want to drink that same amount of alcohol, then get behind the wheel of a vehicle, then yeah, suddenly that's a public health concern, and we do have laws against that because at that point you put other people in danger. It's the same with not wearing masks. Maybe not to such an extreme extent, but we do have a virus that is still mutating, that is still spreading, that is highly transmissible. The Delta variant is much more likely to make children sick than, COVID original. And this is what we're dealing with right now. So while I may not agree with him on quite possibly anything else, I do applaud Senator Cassidy for taking the time and responding to the question correctly. He could have been a little more overt about it, but I'm not going to ding him for that. This should be a decision that's up to each individual school board after hearing from parents, after listening to medical professionals. Because we've seen far too many videos, by the way, of angry, deranged, anti-vaxxer parents saying, we don't need vaccines, we don't need masks. You can probably ignore those people. Maybe have the school board just meet with the doctors. Or maybe have them go visit the hospitals in states like Florida and Texas that are currently filling up. And then they should be the ones to make the decision on whether mask mandates go into place. And another good point about that, according to a new poll, a majority of Americans, including a large percentage of non-vaccinated Americans, actually are okay with vaccine mandates. This is remarkable. Here it is. According to a late July Morning Consult poll, 56% of adults said employers should probably or definitely require COVID-19 vaccinations for their employees and customers. Only 32% said they probably or definitely should not. That confidence extends to schools too. Last month, Gallup found that 60% of Americans supported mandatory vaccines for high school students and 56% supported them for middle school students, although among K through 12 parents, those numbers were notably lower, 47% and 43% respectively. And 28% of unvaccinated people actually support mandatory vaccines. So all this fear-mongering that we see, coming from the right mostly, there is still some coming from some folks who claim to be on the left, but it's all, for lack of a better term, nonsense. It's BS. We don't want mask mandates. Actually, look at the polls. People do. They're okay with it. They don't see it as a violation of their freedom. They see it as protecting other people. Hell, when you have 28% of people who aren't even vaccinated yet saying, yes, this thing should be mandatory, that tells you a lot here. And unfortunately, that is probably where we're headed. I say unfortunately because there are still people who are hugely against this. And I wish we honestly didn't have to get to the point where we had to mandate this thing. But too many people fell for the misinformation. Too many people fell for the lies. And so now here we are. It would have been great if we had every eligible and healthy enough person, because that's an important distinction to make, who was able to get the vaccine if they had gotten the vaccine, and we wouldn't even be talking about a Delta variant today, maybe. And about that distinction real quick, because I do want to point out, yes, there are plenty of people here in the United States who are physically incapable of getting that vaccine. Immunocompromised people, people allergic to some of the things in the vaccine, so they can't get it. And trust me, whenever I talk about things like this, I'm not saying you guys should have to get it at all. You cannot. It puts you in danger when you get the vaccine. So even if we ended up with any kind of vaccine mandates, I think they would definitely have to carve out that exception for those individuals. But if it's just somebody who says, no, I don't want to get it because I saw a video and a woman said it made her magnetic, okay, you know what? That's not a valid reason because that's not actually a thing that happened. And I'm sure we've all seen that video from Ohio where they were having the hearing and the woman came in and said, look, even my keys stick to me. And then the key didn't stick to her because she's not magnetic. And I think David actually pointed out on social media, has anybody even thought about maybe being magnetic isn't that bad? What really is the drawback to that? It was humorous, of course. But here's the thing, and this isn't so funny. We're at a point where most people in this country who are of eligible age, there's no longer the long lines. There's no longer the fight to get in to get the vaccine. They're open. You can go to most pharmacies here in the United States. If there is a line, you're going to wait a couple of minutes. And you can go and get this vaccine. It really is that simple for those who are eligible and are not in any kind of danger when receiving the vaccine. That's where we're at. And most Americans understand that. And I think that's why these poll numbers are the way that they are. Because people see, you know what, we could be getting this. Yes, COVID is getting worse, and I see that now. Not to mention, of course, all of the stories that we've seen of people who didn't get vaccinated, then died. And unfortunately, we have another one of those. Last week, a former Newsmax host and right-wing shock jock, as they're calling him, by the name of Dick Farron, died of COVID. Now, Farron had spent a lot of time during the pandemic trashing Dr. Fauci, calling the entire pandemic a scam-demic, and essentially trying to downplay everything, downplay the effectiveness of the vaccines, casting doubt on those, casting doubt on the pandemic itself, saying, oh, this is Democrats trying to control things. Dies last week from COVID. But before he died, he had one of those come to Jesus moments that we have seen far too often in the people who die from the virus. He texted his friends telling them, go get the vaccine. So here was somebody who had devoted more than a year of his media career to try to convince people that this wasn't real, that this wasn't a big deal, that it was all a scam. And the last thing he did on this earth was tell his closest friends, it's real. Protect yourselves. Get the vaccine. Now he's dead. We also had the story last week of Scott Appley from Texas, Republican official on a county board from Texas. He died of COVID. He died of COVID 5 days after posting anti-vax material on Facebook. Left behind a young, I believe, infant son. Left behind a wife. Dead from COVID. These stories of people dying from COVID after spending a year and a half pretending it didn't exist are becoming far too common. We are now at the point where we're getting at least one per day. And a lot of them all in the same way. Before the person dies, they're tweeting out, they're texting out, they're doing whatever they can. They're calling their loved ones and saying, please get the vaccine. I can't believe I didn't do this. I was too stupid, some of them have said. And that really is what we're looking at here, folks. I'm willing to bet I would never have agreed with anything Dick Farron ever said, ever, in his political career. And I still wish that that man were alive today. Same thing with Mr. Scott Appley. Same thing with all of these people that are dying because they didn't want to do the one thing that probably would have saved their lives. Every death is a tragedy. Doesn't matter if it's on the right or on the left, if it's a anti-vaxxer or if it's a, whoever. Every death is a tragedy. And it's unnecessary at this point too. Stories like this are hard. Stories like this are getting very, very hard to report on. But I do want to continue to do this because hopefully they get through to some people. Hopefully this acts as the wake-up call when you hear these stories of people gasping in their final breaths saying, I wish I'd gotten the vaccine. Asking their doctors, can I still get it? And the doctor having to tearfully tell them, I'm sorry, but it's too late. That's the country we're living in now. And that's a country that has been consumed with misinformation. I'm Farron Cousins, and for David Pakman, we'll be right back.
Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time, and plenty of other awesome membership perks, go to joinpacman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpacman.com.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I am Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. And don't forget, you can find me on YouTube, youtube.com/TheRingOfFire and youtube.com/FarronBalanced. We had a lot of movement over this past weekend on the infrastructure bill, the slimmed down infrastructure bill. We still, of course, have reconciliation on the other part, which unfortunately not going so well. But let's talk about what is kind of going well at this point. Senate did vote to move forward on infrastructure negotiations, infrastructure debate. Really good, like I said, positive developments. It looks like you are getting some Republicans who are starting to come around to this. Obviously, whatever happens in the Senate, this thing still has to go through the House of Representatives, where it's going to go through even more changes. So far from over at this point, but we are seeing forward progress. But there's somebody who's not happy about forward progress. Somebody who has been shouting for 2 weeks now that forward progress is a bad thing. And you guessed it, ladies and gentlemen, that person is none other than former President Donald J. Trump. Trump issued a warning to Republicans over the weekend. And he said, Joe Biden's infrastructure bill is a disgrace. Will be very hard for me to endorse anyone foolish enough to vote in favor of this deal. You know what I love about that statement? It's such a small statement, okay? It's so tiny. It's just a little sentence. 2 sentences, I guess, technically. But it says so much about American politics today, not just about Trump, not just about the Republican Party, but it says so much about politics. So I have to break this statement down. Again, this tiny little statement, I'm breaking it down 3 different ways. The first one is take off partisan blinders. Get rid of hatred for Trump. Get rid of support for infrastructure, all of that. Let's just look at this as political strategy, because what I'm going to say here might shock you. From a strategy standpoint, Trump is right. I know. It's weird to even say it. But he's right. What's the Republicans' best chance to win in the 2022 midterms? Showing the public that the Democrats couldn't get anything done. Showing the public that all these lofty goals of the Democratic Party fell flat. And of course, by doing that, they're going to omit the part where they're the ones who made it all fail. That's how the talking point works. But Mitch McConnell was very clear a couple months ago when he said on camera, we've got to make sure that they can't move forward on their agenda, because McConnell knows the same thing. They've got to make a pitch to voters, because so far all their attacks on Biden have failed. That's another important thing to remember, folks. All their attacks have failed so far because they don't have anything real to attack him on. So if they give him this infrastructure package, that is a big win for the Democratic Party. Not as big as it should have been, certainly not as big as they were asking for in the plan. But if the Democrats produce, if the Democrats go to the public and say, we got you this. Because remember, it's not just an infrastructure plan, folks. It is a jobs plan that is widely supported by members of both parties out there in America. So, again, this is only looking at this through nonpartisan eyes. Trump saying, do not support this. That is what the Republicans would be doing, except, of course, the other side of that strategy. And this is where Trump is totally wrong on it. As I just mentioned, majority of Republicans out there support this. Heck, a majority of Republicans even support raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations to pay for it. They supported it before it was even cut down to $1.2 trillion. They liked it when it was $3.5 trillion. They want the plan. So they would be less likely in turn, based on that, to believe Republican talking points that Democrats were unable to deliver, because they're clearly paying at least somewhat attention to this issue. And that's another positive development. They know who's holding this thing up. They know that they want it, And they know that Republicans, and to a degree Manchin and Sinema, don't want them to have it. So that's why Republicans are stuck between the rock and a hard place here on terms of strategy. They want to get Democrats to lose. But they can't have their voters who support this bill know that they were the ones who kept it from making it to them. So I think at this point, some of them, clearly not all of them, but I do think some of them have looked at this and said, you know what? The best path forward for us is probably to let this thing happen. At least, hey, maybe then, if there are some positive developments out of it once it passes, I can go back to my constituents and tell them, I supported this thing. I did this for you. I did this for you. So that could likely be the strategy that these people take moving forward. And, of course, there's also the third part, and that is, who cares if Trump withholds his endorsement? There was a study that came out last week, and I actually spoke about this on my other channels because it's a phenomenal study. I love it. They looked at races where Donald Trump endorsed a candidate versus races where Donald Trump did not endorse a candidate. And the political scientists who looked at all of these endorsements and all of the outcomes came to a statistical conclusion that a Donald Trump endorsement makes you 2.5% less likely to win your race. Candidates who received the Trump endorsement, again, 2.5%, not 2.5 times, 2.5% less likely to win. So it's a very, very tiny disadvantage, but it's a disadvantage nonetheless. And the report also did mention that, yeah, when Trump endorses a candidate, they end up raising a ton more money. But you know who else does? Their opponent. Every time Trump comes out and endorses somebody, they raise more money, but so does their opponent. They also found that voter turnout actually does increase in races where Donald Trump endorses a candidate, but again, in most instances, it benefits the opponent, not the person Trump endorsed. So Trump wants to be the kingmaker. He's out there pretending to be the kingmaker. He's threatening them, trying to scare them into submission, saying, I'm not going to endorse you if you don't do this. And Republicans need to respond with good. Like, please don't endorse me. In fact, could you endorse my primary opponent? Because I really want to win this election. And your endorsement at this point is effectively a kiss of death. You're not helping candidates. You're hurting them. You're literally making things more difficult for them. So don't come out there acting like, well, I'm going to withhold my endorsement. Don't threaten us with a good time, man. We've seen the numbers. We know what the data looks like. We know that your endorsement doesn't change people's minds. And when it does, it changes them in favor of the other candidate. So again, Republicans, you're not actually stuck between the rock and the hard place here. You've got a pretty easy out. Vote in favor of the infrastructure package, go back to your constituents, tell them that you delivered it for them, and give Donald Trump the finger on the way out the door. Because trust me, you don't want his endorsement unless, of course, you're looking forward to early retirement. That would really be the only thing that would work in your favor at that point. And speaking of people who have things working in their favor, it was recently reported that U.S. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy has awarded a massive contract. The post office has awarded a massive contract. He swears he wasn't involved in the process. But they have awarded a massive contract to a company called XPO Logistics. And those of you who have been following, Louis DeJoy's story for the past year, I'm sure that company name certainly rings a bell, right? Because XPO Logistics happens to be the company that Louis DeJoy, up until October, held a massive financial interest in. But he divested from that company in October. Kind of. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington says that this is really a sham divestment because all he did was give all of his holdings to his children, who in turn will most likely just give it all back to him once he is no longer the Postmaster General of the United States. And again, the contracts being steered towards XPO that DeJoy swears he didn't have a hand in total $120 million, which could result in a net windfall for the DeJoy family of $23 million. So the big question everybody has, of course, is why is Louis DeJoy still the Postmaster General of the United States? And the answer is because, man, the post office infrastructure is set up weird. That is honestly the best way I can describe it. Going through, and I'm not sure if David has explained this, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it in a really slimmed down version here. But to just sum it up, incredibly hard to remove a Postmaster General. Here's what's happening. Biden cannot fire Louis DeJoy. He is powerless to stop DeJoy. But what he can do is he can appoint new members to the Board of Governors, of which he's already nominated 3. They have not been approved. And then the Board of Governors are the ones who get to vote to oust the Postmaster General. Here's a problem, though. There's 3 vacancies. Biden's nominated people for those. And if and when they get approved, Democrats will have the majority on that Board of Governors. So you would think at that point that DeJoy's history, right? Nope. Because 2 of the Democrats on that Board of Governors were appointed by Trump. And those same 2 Democrats actually voted in favor of this New Deal. So they're okay with it. They're okay with DeJoy. So Biden can get his people there. Democrats will have the majority, but they still probably not going to remove him at that point. So then what's the remedy? Well, I'm glad you asked. The remedy is Biden can fire members of the governor's board with cause. Now that little statement, with cause, or for cause, I think is how it's phrased. Very difficult. Because cause can mean anything, and cause can mean nothing. And cause can be a very specific incident depending on which court is looking at it. And that's what's so worrisome here. Firing these individuals for not removing Louis DeJoy for a very obvious conflict of interest would be considered cause, depending on which court hears this case. Now, does it have to go before a court? Absolutely not. But if these individuals sue alleging that there is no cause, it would go in front of a court. And the experts have pretty much agreed that's what would happen if Biden fired any of these individuals. So we are effectively stuck for the moment. I know we'd like to think that Biden could do something about this, but honestly, this is one of those times where his hands are tied. And it sucks so bad that that is the position that we are in, but unfortunately it is the position that we are in. And DeJoy, it appears, is going to continue to use this position to make as much money as possible for when that day comes, when he's no longer the Postmaster General. And to me, that day can't come soon enough, but I'm worried that it may not come anytime soon. I am Farron Cousins, in for David Pakman, and don't forget, you can get even more from me on my YouTube channels, youtube.com/TheRingOfFire, youtube.com/FarronBalanced, and I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FarronBalanced. We'll be right back with more of The David Pakman Show.
If you value what we do at The David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
Welcome back to The David Pakman Show. I am Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. Well, I've already talked earlier in the show about Republican strategy for the midterms, talking about the fact that one of the things they need to do is make sure that Democrats aren't able to deliver for the American public. But there's another thing that they're trying to do. Republicans across the country are trying to create these fake boogeymen to basically drum up their base and get them to be angry about something that doesn't even exist. Recently, writing for Business Insider, Manny Fidel put out a phenomenal article that I want to spend some time talking about because it's just so great. Title of it here is Republicans are winning political battles by arguing against non-existent boogeymen. And one of the first examples he talks about is a recent tweet from Ben Shapiro, where Shapiro was whining about, the updated CDC guidelines recently. The vaccinated people need to wear masks. And Shapiro started going on a rant about, hell no, he's not going to wear a mask inside his own house, and his wife's not going to wear a mask inside their own house, and their kids aren't going to do that. And Republicans got all drummed up and said, oh, hell no, that's not happening. And then none of them bothered to think for a second that that's not happening. That's not an actual thing that the CDC said was going to happen. Didn't even come close to implying that. Nobody has ever said when you're in your own home, you have to wear a mask. But that didn't stop Shapiro from implying that, and then, of course, getting all of his little lemmings to go along with it and to become outraged by it. And that is just a tiny, tiny sliver of what Republicans are doing. They're trying to strawman their way to a victory in the midterms. And as Fidel points out, it's because they can't run on actual issues. Now, this is something I have been talking about for years, and this is the point I love to make. The Republican Party has not had a new idea in 40 years. The last new idea they had, this groundbreaking new thing they came out with and said, hey, look, here's a thing we've created, was trickle-down economics. And I'm sure we all know how well that worked out for everybody. But again, to their credit, it was a new idea. Just because it was a horrible idea, an economically devastating idea, it doesn't mean it wasn't new. But that was the last time that party collectively put their heads together and said, what can we do? And ever since then, it's been a rehash of the same dang thing every time they get in power. Trickle down, trickle down, trickle down. Hasn't been a Republican president in my lifetime that hasn't overseen some kind of recession, at least one recession, and a lot of it is tied to the trickle-down economics. And then, of course, Democratic presidents have to come and try to clean up the mess. We've never rebuilt the economy from when Reagan came out and destroyed unions and enacted trickle-down for 8 years. Yeah, it's been horrendous ever since then. The middle class has all but disappeared here in the United States. And even when we do have the recoveries, like what we're in now, we're not creating good-paying jobs. But look at me here, folks. I am getting off on a tangent. That's a story for another day, and maybe we'll talk about it. I've got some more fill-ins coming next week. But anyway, here's the thing. Back to the straw man issue. Shapiro's not the only one doing it. We have Republican governors all across the country passing these massive voter suppression laws. And they're doing it, they say, to get rid of all the fraud in these elections. Oh, Democrats want everybody to have a right to vote, they tell us, even illegal immigrants. We've all heard that talking point, not just from the 2020 election. We've been hearing that talking point from Republicans for well over a decade or two. Democrats want to give illegal immigrants the right to vote. Nope. Nobody ever suggested that, ever. Ever. But they use it, and the little Republican lemmings go out and they repeat those talking points. You see it on Facebook. You see it on Twitter. You see it constantly because there's no critical thinking. They get told a thing that is a blatant lie, and then they go out and repeat it so others get outraged by it. Another great example of legislating where it's not even necessary, transgender athlete bans. Right? State of Florida signed one of those. Oh no, if you were born a male, you cannot compete even if you identify as a female now. You cannot compete in women's sports. That wasn't a problem we were having here in the state of Florida. In fact, even if it were a thing that were happening, it still wouldn't even be an actual problem. But our governor in between not letting us protect our kids from COVID, has been working on all of these horribly oppressive laws to address problems that don't actually exist here in the United States. There is no epidemic of people who were born men and later identify as women encroaching on women's sports and just dominating everybody. That's not happening enough to even warrant legislation, especially because this legislation is clearly biased, because it also says, but if you're a woman, if you're born a woman and then you identify as a man later in life, you can still play. You can play men's sports. We're totally cool with that. So yeah, weird, doesn't address a real actual problem, but the talking points that led up to that did get Republicans in a frenzy. They got everybody thinking, oh my God, we've got this horrific thing. All the men are in women's sports, the women are in men's sports. Who knows what's what? I'm scared and confused. And that's why we end up with this legislation, because they can't actually talk about the real issues. We've seen it with the Tea Party, as Manny Fidel also points out in his piece. Tea Party was basically funded by billionaires from the start, convincing people that Obamacare was going to be communism, or that you were going to be taxed to hell and back in order to pay for this. Two things, by the way, that never actually happened. But they got people to think these things were true, and they went out there and did the billionaires' bidding. It's the same thing when you see somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene refer to Democrats as communists. They're not communists. But you say it enough, the lemmings believe it. The lemmings get mad about that. The lemmings start to yell, we're not going to have communists in our dang country. No siree, Bob. And they do all of this. In fact, the entire culture war exists because Republicans are so terrible on real issues. They can't talk about the economy. As I mentioned, every Republican president in my lifetime has overseen at least one recession during their tenure. They suck at the economy. Well, they can't really talk about middle class because their trickle-down economics have destroyed the middle class. They can't really gripe about wages and what to do about that because they're the ones kind of holding up the whole increasing the minimum wage thing. They can't talk about health care because, well, they don't want anything to change and the current system's killing people. They don't want to do anything that's actually going to benefit real American citizens. They only care about their wealthy donors. You know, repealing environmental standards, increasing the amount of mercury in the air and water, that doesn't benefit us. That actually hurts us, folks. But they still push this as some kind of freedom from tyranny. A tyranny that doesn't exist. Most of these Republican boogeymen don't actually exist. But they would rather fight against these phony enemies because it's really hard, by the way, to disprove a negative. So when Republicans go out there and they just make stuff up to be mad about, like, oh my God, Joe Biden wants to muzzle all your dogs out there. How dare he? We can go out there and we can say, wait, no, he doesn't. But they're going to say, but yes, he does. Show me the evidence where he doesn't. There's no evidence that he doesn't because he didn't do the thing. So you see what I mean? Like, it is very hard to disprove a negative. And that's how Republicans win on these issues, unfortunately. They get people worked up with lies and misinformation and stupid talk, to be frank with you. And then we always end up having to be on the defensive trying to correct the record. And unfortunately, that's an uphill battle because by the time we've finally figured out a way to address the nonsense, Republicans have already told 10 more lies before we could even finish debunking the first one. And speaking of lies, you can't really talk about lies these days without talking about Arizona, right? That ballot audit that actually over the weekend reports came out said, hey, it's drawing to a close. So, that'll be fun. I wonder if that'll be, coincide maybe with Mike Lindell's grand cyber symposium this week. But either way, an even bigger story came out this past weekend about the Arizona audit. And this one is truly disgusting. And it also is representative of what we've seen happen to officials all over the country since the 2020 election. A Republican member of Maricopa County's Board of Supervisors, a man by the name of Bill Gates. No, not that Bill Gates, but I'm sure that doesn't help with Republicans. He spoke with CNN over the weekend and he said this. Unfortunately, the threats continue and they're not simply organic. They're being driven, unfortunately, by members of the Arizona State Senate and other Republicans across the country. We receive phone calls into our offices at the Board of Supervisors, our staff, saying that our families are going to be slaughtered and threatening us to stop standing up for the good elections workers of Maricopa County. So any Republican that dares to question the narrative of a stolen election in Arizona, any of them who dare defend the integrity of that election in Arizona are getting death threats. We have actually seen this happening in Arizona since, I guess really since the audit started. And there was actually videos of the angry mob of Trumpsters, that came in there and wanted to get through, and they weren't allowed to be in there because it was a ballot audit, but we've seen those videos. Georgia election officials mentioned earlier this year, they were getting death threats. Even Raffensperger and his wife, the Republican Secretary of State and his wife, said they were getting death threats. It's happened in Pennsylvania. The death threats are coming from these crazed Trump cultists who genuinely believe that this election was stolen. So anybody who comes out and says the opposite must be the enemy. That must be somebody to be destroyed. And that is what they're threatening here, folks. That's where we've landed. That's where we've gotten. And it's sickening and it's disgusting. And unfortunately, the lies that are causing people to get this worked up are not ending. If anything, they're getting worse. And there has to come a day of reckoning. All of the abuse that these individuals are suffering, all of the death threats that they are getting, something eventually has to happen to the individuals getting people this worked up. To Trump himself, to Mike Lindell, to Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood. There has to be accountability for Rudy Giuliani, for anyone else out there spreading these lies. Accountability has to happen because people's lives are at stake now. And they're at stake because of the lies being pushed by these deranged individuals who refuse to accept the obvious, and that is the public rejected Donald Trump. Thank you for sitting here with me today. It's been an honor filling in for David Pakman these past 2 days. I will be back for 2 more days next week. In the meantime, you can find me on YouTube, youtube.com/fairanbalanced, youtube.com/theringofire, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @FairandBalanced. Stay tuned for the bonus show. Got some great stuff coming up there for the members. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman.